ever feel like you're walking into a courtroom and the stakes are, well, eternal?
Yeah.
That's kind of the vibe
Yeah.
that we get from Hosea chapters 4 through 10.
Yeah.
We're diving into an analysis of those today.
Right.
Where God takes center stage.
Okay.
Not so much as a benevolent shepherd,
Right.
but as a plaintiff
Yeah.
bringing a lawsuit against his people, Israel.
It is, it's quite a dramatic opening.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about some ancient legal dispute here.
Right.
This text speaks volumes about the human condition,
Right.
about faithfulness, love, and the consequences of turning away from what truly matters.
So let's get into the specifics. What exactly are the charges that are being brought against Israel?
Well, right from the start in Hosea 4, God lays it out. There's a lack of faithfulness, love, and even acknowledgement of him in the land.
Okay, so that's pretty serious stuff. But how does this ancient legal drama, how does that connect with us today?
Okay.
I mean, is this just a historical footnote or is there something deeper here?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because the text highlights this idea of having knowledge but lacking wisdom.
Okay.
We might be swimming in information in our modern world,
Right.
but are we actually living in a way that reflects true understanding and alignment with God?
I see what you're saying. It's like we can have all the facts and figures,
Yeah.
but if we don't apply them in a way that honors God and leads to right action,
Right.
are we truly any better off?
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how this text doesn't just present a cold, hard list of offenses.
Yeah.
It delves into the emotional reality of the situation.
Right.
God doesn't just state the facts.
Yeah.
He expresses his profound grief and frustration.
Okay, so we're not just talking about some distant, detached deity here.
Yeah.
This is a God who's deeply invested in his relationship with his people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In chapter 5, God even describes himself as a roaring lion, tearing apart what he loves because of their actions.
Wow.
It's a powerful image, and it's meant to evoke a strong emotional response.
That's intense. It definitely makes you stop and think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that God is deeply affected by Israel's choices.
Right.
But why resort to such drastic measures?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is this just about punishment?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that scholars have debated for centuries.
Yeah.
Some interpret it as pure wrath,
Right.
but others see it as a desperate act of love, a way to shake Israel out of their complacency and draw them back to himself.
So it's like a parent disciplining a child, not out of anger,
Right.
but out of a deep desire to see them grow and flourish.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's about helping them understand the consequences of their actions and ultimately leading them back to a place of wholeness.
Yeah, it's certainly not the kind of God we're used to hearing about, this fierce, roaring lion image.
Yeah,
But I think it makes the story even more compelling, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It reminds us that God is not some distant, unfeeling entity.
Right.
He's deeply involved in our lives, and he cares passionately about our choices.
Okay, so we've got this courtroom drama playing out, a God expressing his intense emotions.
Right.
But then we get to chapter 6,
Yeah.
and there's this sudden shift towards repentance.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
It's almost like a breath of fresh air amidst all the tension and drama.
Right.
We hear this heartfelt plea, "Come, let us return to the Lord."
Mhm.
It's an acknowledgement that things have gone wrong, but there's still hope for reconciliation.
It's a reminder that no matter how far we stray, God is always ready to welcome us back.
Yes.
But then we come across this rather unusual metaphor in chapter 7.
Okay.
God compares Israel to a half-baked cake.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
That's one of the most intriguing images in Hosea.
Okay.
Imagine a cake, only cooked on one side.
Okay.
It's useless.
Yeah.
It can't fulfill its purpose.
Okay, I get the image,
Okay.
but how does that relate to Israel?
Right.
I mean, are they being accused of being useless?
Not quite. The half-baked cake represents an incomplete, lukewarm faith.
Okay.
It's about going through the motions of religious practice without true heart commitment.
Gotcha.
It's about having knowledge of God, but not allowing that knowledge to transform us from the inside out.
So it's like having one foot in and one foot out?
Right.
We might look religious on the surface, but deep down, we're not fully invested.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this raises an important question for all of us. Where are we half-baked in our own lives?
Right.
What areas need more attention, more heat from God to become fully formed?
Yeah.
What are we holding back from him?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It's easy to point fingers at Israel's shortcomings,
Right.
but I think we all have areas where we're holding back from God, right?
Absolutely. We all have those unplowed grounds in our hearts, those areas where we resist God's transforming work.
Hmm. And that brings us to another powerful image in chapter 8.
Okay.
Israel is compared to a wandering bird.
Okay. Flitting from one thing to the next, seeking help and security
Right.
everywhere except from God.
It's a beautiful but tragic image, isn't it?
Right.
They're desperately searching for fulfillment,
Right.
but they're looking in all the wrong places.
Yeah.
They're forming alliances with foreign powers, accumulating wealth, indulging in empty rituals, all in a futile attempt to find lasting satisfaction.
I think we can all relate to that feeling of searching for something more, that sense that there must be something beyond the everyday grind.
Yeah.
But like Israel, we often find ourselves looking for answers in all the wrong places, don't we?
Yeah.
We chase after jobs, relationships, possessions,
Right.
thinking those things will bring us lasting happiness.
And that's the tragedy. We expend so much energy seeking fulfillment in fleeting things when true satisfaction can only be found in a right relationship with God.
So what happens when we continue down that path of misplaced trust, of seeking security and fulfillment in things that can't ultimately deliver?
Well, chapter 9 takes a bit of a somber turn.
We start to see the consequences of Israel's choices catching up with them.
Right.
God's judgment leads to their exile, a forced removal from their homeland.
So is this where the story ends? Is it all doom and gloom from here on out?
Not necessarily. Remember, even in judgment, God's intention is always to bring his people back to him.
Okay.
Discipline, in this case, is meant to lead to restoration.
Gotcha.
It's a painful process, but it's a process designed to ultimately bring them back to a place of wholeness.
There's still hope then.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of exile.
Absolutely. And that brings us to chapter 10 and one of the most powerful images in the entire book.
Okay.
Break up your unplowed ground.
Okay, that sounds intense. What's the symbolism there? Is it about literally tilling the soil?
It's a metaphor, of course,
Right.
but a powerful one.
Okay.
It's a call to action. It's about preparing the soil of our hearts for God to work in us.
Right.
It's about rooting out the things that hinder our relationship with him.
So what does this breaking up actually look like?
It's about recognizing those areas where we've allowed idols to take root, those things we cling to for security and our identity instead of clinging to God.
Yeah.
It's about confessing our sin, repenting of our misplaced trust, and surrendering our will to his.
It sounds like a difficult and painful process.
Yeah,
But also incredibly freeing.
it is. It's about allowing God to break up the hard, unyielding ground of our hearts so that something new and beautiful can grow in its place.
Wow, that's a powerful image to end on. We've covered a lot of ground here, from courtroom drama to half-baked cakes to unplowed ground. It seems like this deep dive is just getting started.
It is. We've only scratched the surface of what these chapters have to offer.
Right.
But I think it's a good place to pause and let all of this sink in for a bit.
Okay.
Let's take a moment to reflect on these powerful images and ask ourselves where we need to break up the unplowed ground in our own lives. I think that's an excellent idea. Let's take a short break, and we'll be back to continue our exploration of Hosea chapters 4 through 10. As we dig deeper into these chapters of Hosea, it becomes clear that this isn't just about pointing fingers at Israel's mistakes.
Right.
It's a love story, really, a story about a God who fiercely pursues his people even when they stray.
A low story with some pretty intense imagery.
Yeah.
We've got roaring lions, half-baked cakes, unplowed ground.
Yeah.
It's not exactly your typical romance novel.
That's what makes it so compelling, right?
Right.
This text isn't afraid to grapple with the raw emotions, the complexities of a relationship that's been fractured by unfaithfulness.
So how do we move from this place of brokenness towards restoration?
Okay.
What are the practical steps we can take to break up that unplowed ground in our own lives?
Well, one of the key themes that emerges in these chapters is the danger of idolatry.
Okay.
Remember that image of breaking up the unplowed ground.
Right.
It's not just about preparing our hearts for God. It's also about rooting out the idols that have taken root there.
Now, when you say idols, I think most people picture those golden statues from ancient times.
Right.
Is that what we're talking about here?
It's certainly part of it, but idolatry goes much deeper than just physical objects.
Okay.
Anything we put before God in our lives can become an idol.
Okay.
It could be money, success, relationships, even good things like family or our careers.
So it's not necessarily about the thing itself,
Right.
but about where we place our ultimate allegiance.
Exactly. If our identity and security are rooted in anything other than God,
Okay.
we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Right.
We're essentially making that thing our God.
Yeah.
And no created thing can bear the weight of that expectation.
Makes me think of that analogy of the wandering bird.
Right.
We flit from one thing to another, searching for fulfillment in things that can't ultimately deliver.
Right.
Is that what happens when we embrace these idols?
Precisely. We end up chasing after fleeting things, thinking they'll bring us lasting happiness. We pour our time, energy, and resources into them.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they leave us empty.
Mm.
Because true contentment, true security, can only be found in a right relationship with God.
You know, it's amazing how these ancient texts speak so directly to our modern struggles.
Right.
Like they're holding up a mirror to our own hearts, revealing those idols we might not even realize we're clinging to.
That's the power of Scripture, isn't it?
Yeah.
It transcends time and culture because it speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
Right?
And those longings, that desire for something more,
Yeah.
can only be fulfilled in God.
So how do we break free from this cycle of idolatry? How do we shift our allegiance from those fleeting things to the one who can truly satisfy?
Well, I think the first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to honestly examine our hearts and identify those things that have become idols in our lives. What are those things we cling to for security, for identity, for purpose?
Yeah.
What are those things that consume our thoughts, our energy, our resources?
That sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we even begin to unravel all of that?
It can be challenging,
Right.
but it's not impossible. Start by asking yourself some simple questions.
Okay.
What are you most afraid of losing?
Okay.
What do you find yourself constantly striving for?
Oh.
Where do you place your hope and trust?
Okay. So let's say we've identified those idols.
Okay.
What's next?
Okay.
Do we just try harder to avoid them?
It's not about simply avoiding them. It's about actively replacing them with something better, something more lasting.
Okay.
It's about shifting our focus from those fleeting things
Right.
to the one who is unchanging,
Right.
who is the source of true security and fulfillment.
So it's about cultivating a deeper relationship with God.
Yes.
But how do we actually do that?
Well, there are many paths to a deeper relationship with God.
Okay.
Spending time in His Word, engaging in prayer, seeking out community with other believers. These are all practices that can help us cultivate that connection.
But it's not just about checking off a list of religious duties, is it?
No, it's about transforming our hearts, our desires, our very way of being in the world.
Right.
It's about aligning ourselves with God's will and allowing His love to flow through us.
That sounds beautiful,
Yeah,
but also incredibly challenging.
it is.
I mean, it's one thing to intellectually grasp these concepts,
Right.
but how do we actually live them out in our everyday lives?
That's the lifelong journey of faith, isn't it? It's a process of continual surrender,
Right.
of allowing God to chip away at those rough edges of our hearts, to break up that unplowed ground and cultivate something new and beautiful within us.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of holiness,
Well-
but about a willingness to continually submit ourselves to God's transforming work.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our need for Him,
Yeah.
our dependence on His grace. It's about acknowledging that we can't do this on our own strength. We need His guidance, His forgiveness, His transforming power in our lives.
It sounds like a lot of letting go, a lot of surrendering control.
It is.
Yeah.
But in that surrender, we find true freedom. We find that peace that surpasses all understanding.
And perhaps we begin to understand the depth of God's love for His people.
Yes.
That fierce, relentless love that pursues us even when we wander.
Absolutely. It's a love that never gives up,
Yeah.
that never loses hope.
Right.
It's a love that's willing to go to any lengths
Yeah.
to bring us back to Himself.
That's a pretty powerful message. But let's be honest, this whole idea of judgment and exile can feel pretty heavy.
Yeah,
Is there any room for joy and celebration in all of this?
absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, I think joy is an essential part of the Christian life.
Okay.
It's not about gritting our teeth and enduring hardship.
Right.
It's about embracing the abundance of God's grace,
Okay.
the freedom that comes from surrendering to His love.
So it's about finding joy even in the midst of the struggle,
Yes,
even when we mess up and fall short.
exactly. Because the good news is we don't have to earn God's love.
Right.
It's freely given.
Yeah,
And that's something worth celebrating.
that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah?
But it's easy to get caught up in the theoretical side of things.
Right.
How do we actually experience that joy, that freedom in a tangible way?
That's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it?
Right.
It's about putting
Yeah.
these principles into practice in our everyday lives.
Okay.
It's about making choices that reflect our allegiance to God.
Hmm.
It's about living in a way that honors Him and brings Him glory.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of recognizing our idols,
Right?
surrendering to God's transforming work,
Yeah.
and finding joy in the midst of the journey.
Right.
But how do we know if we're actually making progress?
Mm,
How do we know if we're truly living in right relationship with God?
that's a great question. I think one of the most important indicators is the fruit that we bear.
Okay.
Jesus said, by their fruit, you will recognize them.
Right.
In other words, our actions, our words, our very way of being in the world
Right.
should reflect the love and grace of God.
So it's not just about our internal experience,
Right.
but about how that experience manifests in our interactions with others.
Exactly. If we're truly allowing God to transform us,
Right.
it will show in our relationships, in our work, in our engagement with the world around us.
That's a challenging but encouraging thought.
Yeah,
It means that this journey of faith isn't just about our own personal piety.
right.
It's about becoming agents of God's love and grace in the world.
Precisely. It's about being the hands and feet of Jesus,
Yeah.
about extending His compassion and mercy to those around us.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. We've talked about the seriousness of sin,
Right.
the pain of exile,
Yeah.
the challenge of idolatry.
Right.
But we've also explored the depths of God's love,
Yeah.
the beauty of His grace, the hope of restoration.
And that's the heart of Hosea's message, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a message of both warning and invitation. It's a call to repentance,
Right.
but also a promise of reconciliation.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that no matter how far we stray, God is always waiting with open arms, ready to welcome us back.
That's a powerful and comforting thought. But I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on for now.
Right.
Perhaps this is a good place to pause and let these ideas simmer for a bit. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our deep dive into Hosea chapters 4 through 10.
Okay, so we've been unpacking these powerful chapters of Hosea.
Right.
And it really does feel like we've been on this journey,
Yeah.
from the drama of the courtroom
Right.
to these really vivid metaphors
Yeah.
about half-baked cakes and unplowed ground.
Yeah.
But I keep circling back to that initial image
Yeah.
of God as the plaintiff
Yeah.
in this cosmic lawsuit
Stark image, isn't it? It forces us to confront the seriousness of sin.
and its consequences. But it also highlights God's unwavering commitment to justice.
And it makes me wonder, if God were to bring a similar lawsuit against us today, what would the charges be?
That's a question each of us needs to wrestle with.
Yeah.
It's easy to focus on Israel's shortcomings,
Right.
but what about our own?
Right.
Where have we fallen short of God's standards? Where have we allowed idols to take root in our hearts?
It's not a comfortable exercise, but it's a necessary one, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, if we're going to experience the fullness of God's grace, we need to first acknowledge our need for it.
Absolutely.
It's-
It's about recognizing that we're not perfect,
Yeah,
that we've all made choices that have led us away from God.
right,
But the beauty of Hosea's message is that it's not just about judgment.
right.
It's about the possibility of redemption.
So it's not too late for us to turn things around,
No,
even if we've messed up big time.
not at all. The invitation to return to God is always open. That's the incredible power of His grace. It's freely available to all who seek it,
Yeah.
regardless of our past mistakes.
That's a truly encouraging thought. But how do we actually turn back to God?
Mm.
How do we make that shift from a place of brokenness to a place of wholeness?
It starts with humility, with recognizing our need for God's forgiveness and guidance. We can't do this on our own strength.
Right.
We need His transforming power to work in our lives.
So it's about acknowledging our limitations, our inability to fix ourselves apart from God.
Precisely. It's about surrendering our will to His,
Yeah.
allowing Him to shape and mold us into the people He created us to be.
It sounds like a lot of letting go,
Yeah,
a lot of trusting that God knows what He's doing, even when we don't understand.
that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Faith is about trusting in God's goodness and love, even when we're walking through difficult seasons.
But it's not just a passive waiting game, is it?
Right.
There must be something active
Yes.
we can do to cultivate that relationship with God.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's about engaging in spiritual practices that draw us closer to Him.
Okay.
Spending time in His Word, pouring out our hearts to Him in prayer, seeking out community with other believers.
Yeah.
These are all ways we can nurture that connection.